Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are starting at Santa Monica Airport in California, and we're planning on doing a flight to Catalina Island. This is a really beautiful airport to land at, and one I hope to go to in real life in the near future. So with that said, I think what we'll try to do is keep this fairly realistic. Obviously there are certain things we can't do in the simulator that we do in real life, but I'll try to keep everything as close to how I would do it in real life as possible. The other thing that I'll do is the one thing that sort of doesn't really work particularly well in the simulator is air traffic control. So we're going to pretend that we have all of the correct clearances and everything necessary to actually make this flight. I will do things like listen to the ATIS, tune to the correct tower frequency, etc. But we won't actually speak or do anything with that. We'll just assume that that's all done. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to assume that the outdoor pre-flight checks have been completed. So assuming that we've done all of those things, we can move on to sort of the internal pre-flight checks, and that goes ahead with this. I'm just going to hide the yoke for now just to get access to the switches more easily. So now let's start the engine and get ready to start moving. We'll go ahead and make sure that now our parking brake is set. So this is now off, this is now on. That's good. We want to make sure that that parking brake is on so that we don't accidentally start moving once the engine is running. We want to make sure that our fuel selector is set to both tanks. In a Cessna, that's pretty easy. In a low-wing aircraft like a Piper, for example, you would make sure it's set on the higher tank or the lower tank, depending on how you start the aircraft. What I usually like to do is start on the lower tank and then switch to the higher tank before takeoff, just to make sure both tanks work properly. So what we usually do is, right now the master is off. I had accidentally left it on earlier. But what we want to do is make sure that we switch the master on and that we check to make sure that we have our fuel tanks or fuel gauges work rather. We'll also switch on our beacon, that should always be on, and we'll switch on our fuel pump temporarily as we start our engine. What we'll do is we'll also make sure that our mixture is set to full rich by putting the red knob all the way in, and I like to pump the throttle 3 times just to make sure that we get a little bit of fuel injected into the engine, and crack the throttle about a 1/4 inch or so, just a little bit, so that we get some RPM as soon as the engine actually starts. Then what we'll do is make sure everything else is set up as we want, and we'll look outside and make sure that there's no one in the area, and make sure that the area is clear, so it looks like that. And in real life, what we do is open the window and yell out as loud as we can, "Clear prop." So I'm going to pretend to do that, "Clear prop," and we can go ahead and get back into the center area. So now we will go ahead and start the engine. Now that the engine is running, we have everything else good. We want to make sure that we have good fuel flow. In this case, it's relatively low, but looks good. We want to make sure that we have good oil pressure and temperature, which looks pretty good as well. Make sure that our ammeter is reading well. And make sure that our instruments seem to be working, and we'll double check them later, but we'll just make sure that on a preliminary glance. And then we'll switch off our fuel pump, make sure the engine stays running, and we want idle just about around 1,000 RPM as well, so I'm just bumping up the throttle to get it to the 1,000 RPM or so. We can just switch on all our lights for now. This isn't really necessary, but for the time being, in a populated area, sometimes it's nice to have the lights on. You can see our trim here is set for takeoff, so that's fine, but we'll leave that alone for now. And we'll enable the yoke again, just to make sure. Alright, so usually what I like to do, actually, let me disable this temporarily for a second. Usually what I like to do is disable the parking brake, add a bit of throttle, and then switch it back on. Make sure we came to stop. If you're looking out here, let's do that one more time, just to look over there and see we start moving briefly, put it back on, make sure that our parking brake works, and then same thing with our regular toe brakes. They look good as well, so we can leave that on. And that way, just double check that everything seems to be working properly. Okay, so now let's go ahead and enable the yoke again. now what we want to do is make sure that our compass matches our heading indicator right here. So in this case, right now it's reading about 325 or so, or just maybe a bit lower than that. So let's go ahead and adjust our heading indicator to read that as well. So we want to be just about 325 or so. Or rather, not, I'm sorry, I'm reading it wrong. 315. Right about here or so. Maybe, yeah, it looks pretty good. Alright, so now let's go ahead and make sure that, obviously this looks good, our attitude indicator as well. Let's make sure that our altimeter works well. So in this case, in order to do that, one, you could listen to the ATIS, which we'll do again just to double check. However, an easy way to do that, especially at an airport without an ATIS, is to actually look at the elevation. So in this case, we know that the elevation of Santa Monica is 170 feet. So we want to make sure that our altimeter is reading that. So right now it's reading actually just about 200 feet. So we might want to actually drop that a bit to read around 170. So that a little bit right about there. Looks good. And we can verify that with our, while we listen to ATIS as well. Alright, so now what we want to do is go ahead and make sure that we switch on the rest of our avionics, which we didn't do over here. That's just the GPS panel, radios as well. We should have done that a little bit earlier. I kind of forgot to do that part. And we're all good on those. Those usually take some time to boot up as well, and so usually you do that a bit earlier to give you some more time. We also want to make sure that our alt mode on the OC transponder is set, and our code is 1200, which is our VFR code. Alright, so actually let's go ahead and tune into the ATIS, and let's listen to what the ATIS is. So in this case, Santa Monica has the frequency for ATIS as 119.15. So let's tune that in. So right now we have 120.1, which is actually the tower frequency, but we'll go ahead, or at least that's what is here. We're actually tuned to 120.675, which we won't need for some time. So let's go with 119.15. You could also tune, sometimes what I do in a real aircraft would be to tune the ATIS on a secondary radio, which actually let's just go ahead and do that, and I'll show you how that works. So what we do is we have our secondary radio here. In this case, we want to tune to 119, oh, it actually is kind of already set to that, so 119.15. So we'll actually just switch over. Now the selected frequency is 120.675, but the tuned frequency is 119.15. And so in order to listen to that, we can enable COM2 by pressing this. And you can see up here we have the text as well, but we can listen to it carefully.
Visibility more than 10.
In this case, we have, I'll actually just look in here, we have information November, we have wind 220 at 10, so therefore we'll probably use runway 21, which makes the most sense. Visibility is good, sky is clear, temperature 21, dew point 13, that's reasonable. Altimeter is 29088, so actually let's go ahead and double check that we've put that in 29088. So that's actually right about here, because we right before the 29090, so it seems pretty good. Departing runway 21, which makes sense. And okay, apparently they switched to information golf now. Interesting.
Altimeter 2988.
So
arriving runway 21. Departing
everything else is pretty much the same. So that's good. Or maybe I missed that it was golf. I thought it was November for a second, but maybe I'll check on that recording later. Okay, so also we would have tower frequency. So let's actually switch this COM2 off. We don't need the ATIS anymore. We would have our tower frequency tuned in. So we have 120.1, which is actually the Santa Monica tower. And we'll go ahead with that. So what I usually like to do is also set the heading bug to the runway indicator. In this case, we're using runway 21. So what we like to do is just set the heading bug to runway 21. And that way, we have everything set up reasonably well. We know what runway we're going to be going on. It's just a little bit of a safety double check, and kind of a little bit easier to use. So our altimeter is set, vertical speed reading 0, which looks good. Our engine is reading 1,000, which looks good. This is sort of level, and the ball is centered, and our airspeed is reading 0. So our instruments here, our 6-pack, look pretty good. In this case, let's go over here, and we can actually double check and make sure that we add our flight plan. So what we can do is go ahead and type in FPL. In this case, I've already entered this before. So we have Santa Monica, we're going to Catalina Island, and so we can go ahead and close this. So actually, let's go ahead and make sure that that's activated. Correct, the arrow should be pointing to Catalina Island, which is our destination. So you can see that this line has picked up. Let's actually zoom out. Oops, sorry. Zoom out, and once we start moving, we'll actually be able to see that. So for now, we'll not worry about that. But we know that we need to go on we are facing a 318 radial. We need to go to a 165 radial, and we know that the distance to our next checkpoint, which in this case is our final destination, is 36.8 nautical miles. So honestly, not too far at all. I mean, this would be a pretty quick flight. I mean, depending on conditions at the airport and things like that, probably half an hour or maybe a little bit longer than half an hour, just to include traffic pattern times and things like that. Obviously, our ground speed is 0 for now, but so far, so good. Nothing out of the ordinary. Now, in real life, what you probably also do, especially in California, in this busy type of airspace, you'll probably talk to, departure control and request flight following or something like that. That's something that I personally definitely would do, just because it's another safety layer. However, in this case, for the simulator, I'm not going to actually go ahead and do that. We're just going to pretend that that's all taken care of. All right, so we've made sure that now we're getting ready for taxi. We made sure that our fuel pump is off for taxi. Just there's no need to run it excessively, but we'll switch that on before we take off. We also want to we can do our run up in this area here before we taxi over, just so that we're out of the way. Now, in real life, of course, you probably double check that there's nothing important behind you. Of course, since this is a simulator, there really isn't anything important behind us. But yeah, in real life, you'd probably double check and make sure that you probably wouldn't want to do that near the parking area, because there might be people or other aircraft or something nearby. So we want to double check our flight controls. So what we usually do is just go ahead and make sure that if I turn right, this goes down. If I turn left, that goes up. It's kind of hard to see here, but that's correct. And we'll also want to look at the rudder. We can't look at the rudder, but we can look at the elevator. Maybe I'll go on an outside camera angle. So here, for example, if we move the elevators, we can see that the elevator goes up and down. And make sure that also, inside the cockpit, there's nothing interfering with the controls. Like, for example, a passenger might be sitting and their knees might be blocking it or something like that. And make sure that, again, now our ailerons work. And we can also double check that our flaps work to full extension. Excellent. You don't have to check the flaps for flight controls, because you've probably already checked it before with the external stuff. But it's a good habit, I guess, to double check. Anyway, so our flight controls are set. We can't really check the rudder directly on the ground, just because it's a little bit harder. But when we have the wheel is directly connected to it, but otherwise we would do that as well. So now what we would do is go ahead and, since we're close to sea level, make sure being full rich, is pretty fine. I don't think we need to worry about that. And we'll stay pretty low. So overall, we don't have to worry about the mixture. I mean, maybe you could lean it a touch as you go higher.
Tower.
You can listen to the tower.
172, 2, Sierra.
Interesting.
Fly heading 210, runway 21. You're cleared for takeoff. Fly heading 210.
That
runway
is kind of strange, because 172 Sierra Papa is us, right? Oh, I see what this is. This is 172 2 Sierra Papa. Okay, I was so confused for a second. I was like, wait, that's us. I'm not talking. But okay, interesting. So they have another aircraft called 172-20 Papa, so an extra 2 in there. Interesting. Everything else has been pretty much set up for now. So what we'll do is our run up, right? So we checked our flight controls. We adjusted our mixture properly. We'll set the power to about 2,000 RPM or so. So we'll bump up the throttle to about 2,000 RPM. Doesn't have to be exactly 2,000, but sufficiently high. And then we'll check our mags over here. So what we were looking for is a drop of about 100 or so. You don't want it to be too much. We don't want the difference between the two magnetos to be more than 50 RPM. So let's go ahead to the left magneto. Not too much of a drop actually at all. That's really good. And then let's go back to the right magneto, or sorry, back to both, and then now to the right magneto. A little bit more of a drop, but reasonable as well. Actually, the left magneto has slightly more drop, but similar. They look pretty much actually the same now that I'm looking at it again. But we're back to both magnetos now. In this case, we also want to check our carb heat, which in this case is, I believe, over here. Actually, I don't know what carb heat is on this aircraft. Interesting, I don't know if there is carb heat in this particular aircraft, so we're going to actually just skip that. But yeah, in the normal aircraft, carb heat is actually, in my aircraft that I fly in real life, it's over here, so that's why I was looking in that area. Okay, so we'll skip the carb heat, assuming that the aircraft doesn't. In real life, you double check, you'll be more familiar with it. We want to check our engine gauges. These look, the tachometer looks good. We want to make sure that oil pressure and temperature are looking good. Fuel flow is good as well. We have a little bit higher before. Our vacuum gauge is reading green and sufficiently high RPM. Our ammeter is also reading just barely positive, so pretty good as well. So now we want to double check that when we drop our throttle back to 0, that the engine stays running, nothing else, the engine doesn't stop for whatever reason as well. And I forgot to say, that's why I switched the fuel pump off as well, just to make sure that the aircraft can run without the fuel pump, the auxiliary fuel pump, because that would be kind of an important thing to check. And same thing in an aircraft, what you would probably do is check one of the fuel tanks here during the run-up, and maybe potentially switch to the other tank before the run-up. That way you can check both tanks. So when you start the engine, you start on the left tank, for example, and then you switch to the right tank when you actually do the run-up. And that way you check both and make sure that they're both working. All right, so we've pretty much done everything else. Our flaps are set to 0. We have our lights and transponder set properly as well. This is correct. We're tuned to the correct frequencies. Our parking brake is on. Our lights are pretty much all on. Comms and navs are on. Everything else is ready. So now we'll go ahead, and again, we'll remember to switch on our fuel pump before we take off. All right, so now that we're ready to taxi, what we'll do is go ahead and make sure that we have our taxi diagram up. So I'm just going to pull up the airport diagram. Okay. All right. So here I have the airport diagram pulled up on my phone. So in this case here, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and, again, we said we're going to be taxiing to runway 21 based on the ATIS, and you can also look up the winds in METAR as well. We saw that the runway, the winds are 220 at 10 or 10 knots, so that's good. Interesting, we have a fuel vehicle here. Kind of a little bit in our way, but not too much. All right, so let's go ahead and release the parking brakes. Got fuel vehicles coming. I don't know if that guy's going to be in our way or not. Interesting. All right, so he's not in our way. Oh, that's a bit scary. I don't know. I don't know what to do. The guy's going to be coming in. All right, so we're here at the transient parking area. I'm going to add a bit of throttle, and now we're moving. Make sure that no one is coming in from either direction. Again, in real life, this is a lot easier because we don't have to worry about all of these simulator-based stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and make sure we go sufficiently slowly. Make sure we're following this. Make sure this guy's parked really close. Taxiing here is pretty challenging. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and make this turn a little bit here, and then make a sharp left turn. So you can see ahead, there are kind of these X's on the runway here, or right before this, on this taxiway, sorry. And that's because the runway here has actually been shortened in Santa Monica, I believe in 2018. And so as a result, we don't use this section of the runway. This is no longer in use. So we'll actually take a left turn along this taxiway and make sure that we followward and get to the correct taxiway to get onto the runway. So in this case here, we want to make sure that we make this turn a little bit sharp. It's okay. Make sure we go in around the aircraft. The other aircraft was kind of parked really closely, so that was a little bit strange. But here we are. There's a taxiway coming up on our right over here. Slow down a touch. And then we will make the right turn. And we can see the sign over here, runway 21, and Bravo 5 is taxiway. A little bit overshot that taxiway. It's kind of hard to control the aircraft here in the simulator with the rudder pedals. It's a little bit more difficult. So here I'm actually, let me just pause here for a second. Here we're going to assume that we have clearance to get onto the runway. We're tuned to the tower, we've talked to them, we've done all of that. We're going to assume that. And before we enter the runway, again, we double check the direction. In this case, runway 21 is to our left. That looks good. And before I enter, I also want to check if there's anyone on final. It's kind of a little bit hard to see, but you could crane your head around to make sure there's no one on final up here. And we would be listening to the radio, and we would have tower as well. So there's a lot of safety checks, but to just double check no one else is landing on this direction as well, just in case. All right, so we've double checked all of that, and we'll get onto the runway. So we'll go ahead, add a bit of power, and make the turn. And we try to use up as much of the runway as possible. It's kind of hard to make this turn in the simulator, but I feel like I'll probably do a little bit better job of lining up and making sure I took up as little space and was at the edge of the runway as possible. All right, so here we are at the runway, ready for takeoff. This is where we would double check, make sure that fuel pump is on just as a safety backup, make sure everything else is correct. And as we go ahead, look out the window, and we're going to advance the throttle slowly but firmly. And we add a bit of right rudder to counteract this left turning tendency. We see that our airspeed is alive. We see that our engine instruments are in the green, the remaining in the green. And as we pass 60 knots or so, we're going to start rotating. And here we are, we're already flying. And so when we climb out, we want to be at a speed called VY, which is our max climb out, maximum climbing speed. In this case, it's about, for this aircraft, 74 knots or so. So I'm a little bit faster than that. In real life, you probably want to be slightly faster than that. And now that we're much further up, actually want to speed up to around 80 to even maybe 90 knots, just so that we're a little bit more nose down and we can see the aircraft in front of us. When we're at VY, we're pretty high, we're facing up, we're pitched up, and we don't really want that. So I like to be around 90 knots. And now I'm trimming down a little bit because we're at pretty high power. So one thing I didn't mention as well is that before we had double checked that our trim was set to takeoff, and now it's a little bit different because I adjusted it. We wanted to double check that before takeoff as well, just to make sure that everything was good. So now we know we need to make this turn towards the 165 radial. So let's go ahead and do that. What you could do is make sure that we're at a good altitude, which we are. Make sure we're coordinated and we're not losing altitude as well during our turn. So looking pretty good so far. Approaching the 165 radial. Want to start straightening out. You can see a little bit hazy out here, but not too bad at all. I think you can see that looks like Catalina Island. Potentially, it's kind of hard to tell for sure, but it looks like it. So now, as we're continuing our climb out, we're going to zoom back out to regular, or adjust ourselves back to the regular. It's kind of a bit sensitive today for some reason. So Catalina Island's airport elevation is about 1,600 feet. So we want to be at a minimum of 2,600 feet to get into traffic pattern altitude when we get there. So I think what we'll do is fly, obviously we're going to fly a little higher than that, but right now we're at about 2,000 feet or so. In this case, we want to make sure we use something called the VFR cruising altitudes, right? And the VFR cruising altitudes are essentially the altitudes that you would cruise at when going in a certain direction. And the real reason that we do that is simply just to make sure that we're avoiding traffic as much as possible. It's also just adjust the heading bug to the 165, or even slightly less than that, just so that we can get back on track. And it helps maintain our direction. We also want to avoid this cloud over here as well. So our VFR cruising altitude in this case, let me just pull up the exact diagram. So here, what we can see, or I guess you guys can't see it, but we're actually just barely before the 180 radial, right? So what we want to do is actually be in the odd thousands. So for example, 3,500. So actually we're coming up on 3,500 feet soon, so what we can do is level off. Now in real life, you'd probably want to go a little bit higher just for safety factor, because you're going above the ocean. You want to be within gliding distance of land. So, in real life, you'd probably be flying much higher, maybe 4,500, 5,500. Well, probably not 4,500, but maybe 5,500 or even 7,500. And, again, it's not absolutely necessary, but that's something that you do if you really were trying to be safe. So you can see this is Catalina Island up here, which is looking really nice. And we'll just make sure that we're right on track. So the airport should be somewhere, I believe, right about here, potentially. We're climbing, so I'm just going to add a bit of forward trim after I push forward on the yoke. That helps relieve the pressure. I'm actually pulling back slightly, because I think I put a little too much trim. And that way we go down, drop back to 3,500, and as we get there, to altitude, I'm going to pull back up slightly. Okay, there you go, we're just about at 3,500. And we're going at a pretty good pace, actually. 120 knots is quite reasonable for a Cessna to be traveling at, so this would be a pretty fast cruise. I mean, we're at pretty much full power too, so almost at red line. So we'll try to make this trip relatively quick. So as we head there, we will have a chance to actually go ahead and put in the ATIS. So again, in real life, we would probably be contacting approach, departure, departure in this case first, and then move on to approach, who would then be able to help you with flight following, avoidance of traffic, get you through the LA airspace over here. That's something that we kind of completely ignored as well, the LA Bravo airspace. But in real life, you would probably want to get clearance to go through that, just to save you a lot of time. Or you could go around the ocean and make sure that you avoid the airspace, which isn't too bad at all, especially given that you could fly around through the corridors below 5,000 feet. In fact, if you did it correctly, you wouldn't need to actually talk to the LA traffic controls, but it'd probably be a good idea just to do that and get clearance, just so you can go faster, especially since that way we wouldn't have to go around so many different things. I'm just adjusting course a bit left and drifting. I haven't been paying as much attention to that. So let's get back on course. And let's actually adjust the heading bug to be a little bit more that way, just so that we can get back onto, you can see the GPS, there's this pink line, which was the line from Santa Monica to Catalina Island. We don't have to be directly on the line, but you know, we could be close enough. And in fact, we're actually, you know, crabbing because the wind is coming in from 220 approximately. Remember, 220 at 10, and at this altitude, it's probably a little bit faster. And you can tell that it's a little bit faster because we're actually facing, you know, over here around 160, but we're actually traveling at a heading of 157. So there's, you know, a little bit of a difference between the two numbers. Although that difference is much smaller than now as we're moving. So we're maintaining our altitude 3,500 pretty well, actually. We're coming up onto this line, so the wind is probably going to be changing as we approach Catalina Island. And our speed, again, is actually quite fast for this type of aircraft. Normally, we wouldn't be flying this fast at all. Probably around 110 knots or so, and that would be much better for fuel economy purposes, because you know, you don't want to be wasting fuel. Also keeps the engine in better condition as well. But this is a simulator, so we don't need to worry too much about all of these things. So again, just maintain our direction. Our altitude is quite reasonably maintained, although we are descending just a touch, it looks like, ever so slowly. So I'm just going to pull back a touch just so that we get back onto our altitude. So now we're about 20 miles out. So at this point, you know, you could start listening to ATIS. I mean, especially with Catalina, there's really nothing in between us and the island anymore. So, you know, you could easily start listening to the ATIS and not worry about anything at all. So we can start with that. Again, what I like doing is tuning it into the COM2 and leaving COM1 as primary communications with the tower and things like that. So in this case, we know that the frequency for Catalina Island for their ATIS is 120.675, and I've flown this flight before, so that's why these numbers are actually already tuned in 120.675. But we'll double check that, and if you were to adjust this knob, you know, you would see this here, and then this smaller knob adjusts the smaller numbers. So let's go back and switch the two, enable COM2. Let's see if we can listen to the ATIS. Oh yes, I remember. I think the ATIS in XPlane for Catalina isn't working particularly well for some reason. I don't know if they've switched the frequency recently or done something else, but or maybe XPlane just doesn't recognize that there's an ATIS at Catalina. I don't know, but for some reason we're not really getting any signal at all. So a little bit surprising. Interesting. Okay, so we'll ignore the ATIS for now. But I do have the METAR for Catalina Island available right here. I have it downloaded. So this is the weather as of today. And it seems that the winds are right now 260 at 7 knots. So 260 meaning we'd probably end up using runway 22, which is actually the better runway for this direction. So that works out really well. But not too bad at all, especially given that it's not too much of a crosswind coming from 260 and using runway 22. So pretty reasonable crosswind component there and low wind speed, so quite good. So we've actually been turning a little left. But this aircraft, for some reason, I'm sorry, to the right. This aircraft, for some reason, has this right turning tendency as we do, you know, as we cruise, which is a little bit odd. I've not seen that in real life. Most in real life, you know, you're probably more able to feel the direction, and you know, it's much easier to control the aircraft in real life than it is in the simulator. One, the controls are much more sensitive here in the simulator than they are in real life. So in real life, you know, the air is moving around. There's a lot more play between, you know, these things, and you know, we're not really worried about it too much. So make sure we avoid this cloud area right about here. So we turn a bit to the right. Probably, it looks kind of close, but the distance to this is probably, you know, a few thousand feet. I mean, it's really hard to tell, judge distances specifically, but we want to try to avoid the cloud as best as we can. See, it's moving actually surprisingly slowly, so it's probably a pretty large cloud, despite looking much closer than it is. Again, just avoid clouds. And we don't want to fly through them. And we can turn back onto course now that we've turned a little bit further away. So actually we want to turn quite a bit more, and the reason is we want to get lined up for the runway. So the runway for Catalina Island is actually runway 22, so we can put that into our heading indicator now. So about runway 22. So at some point we want to line up to this heading, and we need to, can we see the airport from here? See if we can zoom in. I mean, in real life you probably wouldn't be able to see this at all. See some roads over here. Potentially the airport might be over here. Maybe somewhere. I'm not seeing it specifically. Maybe. Oh no, right here. This is the airport. It looks like. It's kind of hard to tell, but that looks like the airport to me. So we're flying basically directly at the airport now. I probably want to be a little bit more, and maybe you can see some clouds up here. So we probably would want to actually start descending just to get a little bit below these clouds. So I'm just going to drop the power a bit. You can see you can drop in power a little bit. Well, I added it right as I showed that, but dropped in power and pulling a little bit back on the yoke. That'll help us slow down and help us descend as well, just to avoid these clouds. Maybe do a little bit more. So I'm adding dropping power pretty much to idle now. See that, and we'll drop down. So this is pretty fast, but it looks like these clouds are kind of lower than I expected. Again, we don't want to go below 2,600 feet, so as we get to that altitude, I'm going to stop the descent. So coming up, adding a little bit more power, you can see the RPM coming up. And we're adding a little more power and pulling up just to arrest our descent. And I haven't adjusted the trim at all yet. So I'm still actually putting a lot of back pressure just to maintain it. And now that we're kind of leveling off here, this is the point where I would add the trim back in. Might actually even want to be, in real life it probably want to be a little lower than this actually. It's still pretty close to the cloud. So I'm going to descend a bit, maybe down to 2,400, and then we'll climb back up. Climb back up to 2,600 as we get closer to the airport. Maybe even 2,200. Again, you want to give plenty of space between yourself and the clouds. So let's drop down to about 2,300 or so. Maybe even a little bit lower, 2,200. Now, technically we are, sorry, I was looking at our chart. Technically we are in Gulf airspace, although we are entering the Echo airspace very soon. Actually, my mistake. We are actually in Echo airspace now, but we will be entering lower Echo airspace in a little bit as well as we get closer to the airport. In just a little bit. Now again, in real life you would probably want to do something like do a flyover of the airport, enter the traffic pattern, do kind of like the loop over it, just to make sure that the runway is safe. At an airport like Catalina Island, that would probably be a good idea, just because it's a little bit less populated, there aren't as many people, as many flights. However, in the simulator we're not going to do that just because it takes a lot of time. And again, we've been descending just to avoid these clouds. But as we get closer to the airport, we want to make sure that we go ahead and we actually climb back up to 2,600 feet, which is the traffic pattern altitude. Now, as we're landing, we want to make sure that we maintain the same type of descent profile as we would in a real regular pattern approach landing. So that's why I'm saying we should go up to about 2,600 feet, just so that we're at the 1,000 feet above the airport. So you can see we're actually been descending a lot just to avoid these clouds. And you can see there's a little bit of haze, but we can still clearly see the land in front of us, the island, and the horizon is reasonably visible, but as long as we can see the land in front of us, that's very important for visibility purposes. So the reason I'm actually flying quite to the left is just so that we line ourselves up with the runway. Still a bit of cloud. But this is where I would start, of course, adding more power and ascending to the 2,600 feet. So we're actually only about 1,200 feet, so we're actually really quite low. In fact, we're at the altitude pretty much of the runway of the airport. So add a lot of power, climb up. We actually have plenty of speed that we can actually bleed off. So this worked out reasonably well. But the runway should pretty much be off our right. Let's see if we can see it. Should be coming up somewhere over here. I think that's it, the airport right there. So since we're actually kind of close, I might actually not go all the way back up to 2,600 feet because we have to configure ourselves for landing. Let's see where the airport is. Actually right here. So we're actually going to drop the power again because we're actually kind of high for the airport. So actually let's make, since we're actually kind of high for the airport, let's do a loop. So we are going to fly over midfield, and then we will do left traffic. So actually, let's go ahead and turn. So this is actually, I kind of messed up a little bit and was way too high. I should have actually planned to do the proper approach. So let's do this correctly. So now on a downwind for runway 4, which is not the runway that we'll be actually landing on. Let's climb back up to 2,600 feet. But we're going to be doing a loop. And in this case, in real life, you'd be looking at the runway, looking at the airport, making sure that it's quite safe to land at. And in the simulator, we don't need to worry too much about all of these things. So we're coming up on our altitude, also quite fast, so we can slow down a little bit and make our turn. So this would be, for example, if we were doing an actual traffic pattern, this would be a left crosswind pattern, or sorry, a left crosswind leg for runway 22. Level off. Let me see the runway probably perfect. A little bit harder to fly because you don't really get the same situational awareness. So it's quite a bit harder to actually fly in this simulator than it is in real life. So now we're going to be turning our left downwind leg. And so I'm actually also, in real life, we would be looking out at the runway and be able to easily see it. I can't really see it very clearly because we have to keep turning the window, but you can use this heading. This is one reason why you keep it at the runway heading indicator. Runway heading. And the reason is that way. Microphone tells you. The reason you do that is because you want to make sure that you can easily line yourself up. So here we are, pretty much lined up with the runway, and we're quite high. So let's slow down, adjust this. And apologies, I kind of messed that last bit up with the wrong approach because we're a little bit way too close to the airport. But now we're reasonably lined up. So we're going to be landing this way, You want to go out a little bit to the ocean. Oh, again, falling off. Thanks for that. Alright. So this is where you'd probably slow down quite a bit, drop some altitude as well to get back down. And we would probably put 1 notch of flaps, maybe about now. We just entered the white arc right over here. It's our flaps safe speed, so we'll put in 1 notch of flaps. That pitches us up, so I push down on the yoke just to make sure we stay reasonably pitched, and pitch a little bit more down just to maintain our speed, and then add a touch of power again just to maintain our speed. So let's make sure we're, see, the airport is actually going out of our view. So let's go ahead and make our left base. I'm adding just again a touch of power just to maintain our speed. And we should maintain about a 500 to 600 foot per minute descent as we do that as well. So again, in real life you'd be looking for the runway. I'm using this heading bug right here just to make sure that we're reasonably aligned. But in real life, yeah, you would definitely be using the actual runway as a visual reference, which would be a way better idea than the heading bug, because this has some drift to it as well. Alright, let's see if we can see the runway. Apologies, this is so kind of difficult for us. We can see where the airport is. Am I missing the airport or something? Where is it? Alright, returning our final leg. I'm trying to look for the airport. I feel like I've lost it. Oh, there it is, sorry. It's kind of hard to see amidst that. So we are a little bit long. So in this case, what I'm going to do is level off just a bit and add a bit more power. Now, since this runway has a very high sort of angle, it's like quite a hill, you probably would want to avoid maybe using full flaps and actually go slightly faster. And that way you can pull up and continue doing a go around if necessary. So in this case, I won't be using full flaps, but I'll be using 2 notches. So right now we only have 1 notch of flaps. I'm going to be adding the 2nd notch of flaps in just a few seconds. Dropping the power a bit, switch it up a bit fast, and are adding our 2nd notch of flaps. You can see we're pitching up a little bit, so I'm compensating by pushing down with the yoke. And we want to make sure our descent is good. We're at just about 60 knots, which is a little bit which is pretty good, but a little bit on the slower side. You probably want to be a little bit faster, especially with only 1 notch. I'm sorry, only 2 notches of flaps. But overall, our descent is good. You can see that there's only 1 white. It means we're actually a little bit high, which in this case I think is actually kind of preferable compared to being too low. Here we are landed. It's a bit of a rough landing. I think I could have done a little bit better, but overall not too bad. You can see the hill is kind of evident from here. In real life, it's quite a lot more scary. It feels like you're running out of runway and you're kind of going off into the void, but we'll actually go a little bit further towards the end of the runway just to show that. You can see what it looks like, and you can see there's actually quite a bit more left. And here it is, coming up on the end of the runway. Let's slow down. And we could have turned off at any point, but I just wanted to show the actual end of the runway here. So here you can see runway 4. And we would turn off the runway. onto the taxiway. It's actually a little bit hazy today in Catalina Island. There's a little bit of fog that's kind of obstructing the visibility. It's still probably greater than 10 miles, but not perfectly clear. Oh, oops, brakes are really sensitive for this for some reason. Alright, let's turn on to the ramp area and the FBO, which apparently in real life has really good food as well. So definitely a place worth checking out. Make sure we don't hit any aircraft. And in this case, I'll just park actually here on the right area. Not a huge amount of space, but probably doable. Maybe you would probably put yourself a little bit more on the grass just to make sure that no one comes in and hits you. Perfect. So make sure our power is off. Let's go ahead and set our parking brake. We are a little bit on the grass. Maybe you would shut off and kind of adjust the position of the aircraft so it's a little bit easier to take off or start moving again. But for now, this is pretty reasonable. All right, with that, here we are at Catalina Island. With that said, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, bye-bye.